The forest didn't explode into chaos, it went quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet people imagine when they think of nature documentaries, sunlight filtering through leaves and birds calling in the distance. This silence was heavier than that. It pressed down on the ground, on the trees, on the air itself, like something essential had been taken away, and the forest hadn't yet learned how to breathe without it. The rangers noticed it first at dawn. They had come back to a familiar stretch of protected land, expecting the usual signs of life movement in the canopy. Distant rustling, the low, steady rhythms of a guerrilla group waking up. Instead, they found stillness. Too much stillness. The kind that makes trained professionals slow their steps and lower their voices without knowing why. Then they heard it. A sound so small it almost didn't belong in a place built for giants. A thin, broken cry drifted through the undergrowth, uneven, desperate, and wrong. Not the confident call of a healthy infant. Not the reassuring grunt of a mother nearby. This sound carried no authority, no protection, only need. They followed it. What they found stopped them cold. Curled against the base of a fallen tree were gorilla babies more than one. Their small bodies pressed together as if warmth alone could replace what had been taken from them. Their fur was damp with morning mist. Their eyes wide and searching, moved frantically at every sound. One of them reached out blindly, fingers grasping at empty air, then pulled its hand back to its chest as if realizing again that no one was coming. There was no silverback standing guard, no mother pulling them close, no family. The forest had not raised these babies, it had abandoned them. The signs around the clearing told a story no one wanted to read twice. Broken branches, trampled ground, the absence of tracks where there should have been many. Something had happened here in the dark, something violent enough to erase an entire group, and quiet enough to leave only questions behind. For the babies, the questions didn't matter. They only knew one thing: the arms that were supposed to hold them were gone. One of the smallest let out another cry, weaker this time, its voice cracking halfway through, as if its body no longer believed the sound would bring comfort. Another rocked back and forth, a self-soothing motion, learned too early, born not from security, but from shock. These were not behaviors meant for infants this young. These were the movements of beings who had already learned loss. The rangers stood there longer than protocol allowed. Years of training told them what the odds were. Gorilla infants without their mothers rarely survive on their own. They need constant care, feeding, protection, guidance. They need touch. They need someone to teach them how to exist in a world that, without warning, had turned hostile. These babies had none of that. Someone finally whispered, "They won't make it long." No one disagreed. The rescue team moved carefully, knowing every sudden motion could trigger panic. When they reached for the first baby, it recoiled, not aggressively but instinctively, then froze as if torn between fear and exhaustion. Its body was warm but too light, too still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm, but from running out of strength. As they gathered the babies one by one, the forest remained silent. No mother charged from the trees. No silverback roared in warning. No protective force emerged to challenge the intrusion. That absence was the most devastating part. At the temporary care site, the reality became even harder to escape. The babies cried in waves, soft, broken sounds that rose and fell without rhythm. They reached for each other, clinging as if proximity alone could rebuild a family. When caretakers tried to feed them, some resisted, turning their faces away, their bodies tensing as if the act itself felt wrong, without the presence they associated with safety. This wasn't just hunger, it was grief. Experienced staff had seen trauma before. They had worked with injured animals, orphaned wildlife victims of human cruelty, and environmental collapse. But there was something uniquely devastating about gorilla infants. Their intelligence, their social nature, their deep reliance on family made loss cut deeper and show sooner. One caretaker sat on the ground beside the enclosure, long after her shift ended, watching the smallest baby rock itself to sleep. "They don't understand where she went," she said quietly. "They just know she didn't come back." As night fell, the facility dimmed. Lights were lowered, sounds were softened. Everything possible was done to create calm, but calm never came. The babies slept in short bursts, waking, suddenly crying out their bodies, searching for a familiar heartbeat that no longer existed. Every instinct in them screamed that something was wrong, that the world had broken its promise. Outside, the forest remained unchanged. Trees stood tall. Insects hummed. Life indifferent and relentless went on. Inside, a question hung in the air, one no one could answer yet. How do you save a life that doesn't know how to live without the one it lost? There was no plan for this, no manual, no guarantee, only a quiet, terrible truth settling into the room without someone unexpected. These babies were not just orphaned, they were fading, and the forest that had once raised them had already fallen silent. No one planned for a mother to appear. After the first days, the rescue center ran on exhaustion and routine. Feedings every few hours, medical checks, long, quiet nights broken by sudden cries that echoed down the corridors and made even seasoned staff pause in their steps. The babies were alive, but barely. They ate just enough to survive, slept in fragments, and clung to one another as if afraid that letting go would make the world disappear again. Everyone was doing their job. No one was doing what a mother does. That was when the unexpected presence began to matter. Her name was Maggie. She was not a primate specialist. She wasn't part of the gorilla program at all. Maggie was a medium-sized mixed-breed dog who had lived at the sanctuary for years, officially adopted by the staff after being rescued from neglect. She had one job: comfort. She wandered the grounds freely, curling up near stressed animals during storms, sitting beside injured wildlife during recovery, sensing tension before people ever named it. No one had ever thought to keep her away from the gorillas. At first, no one thought to invite her in either. The first time Maggie appeared at the doorway of the nursery, it was an accident. A volunteer had forgotten to latch the gate fully, and Maggie padded in quietly, nails clicking softly against the floor. She stopped just inside the room, ears low-tail, still taking in the scene, with a stillness that surprised everyone watching. The babies noticed her immediately. One of them lifted its head, eyes fixing on her, with a focus that hadn't appeared for days. Another stopped crying mid-breath, the sound catching in its throat as if curiosity had interrupted grief. Maggie didn't move closer. She didn't bark. She didn't wag. She simply sat down and waited. The room held its breath. Someone whispered, "Should we take her out?" No one answered, because something was happening. The smallest baby began to crawl, not toward a bottle, not toward a caretaker, but toward Maggie. Its movements were clumsy, uncertain, driven by something deeper than logic. When it reached the bars separating them, it pressed its tiny hand against the metal and stared. Maggie lowered her head. That was all. No sudden movement, no attempt to cross a boundary. Just a quiet lowering of her body, as if to say, "I see you." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't in any protocol. Dogs weren't meant to bond with gorilla infants. There were risks, health, behavior, attachment. Years of training whispered warnings in their ears. But the baby stopped crying. For the first time since arriving, it stopped. That moment didn't change policy, not yet. Maggie was gently guided back out, the gate secured properly this time. The day continued. Feedings resumed. Charts were updated. The world tried to return to order, but the babies didn't. That night, the crying returned louder, more desperate. One infant refused to eat at all, turning its face away, even when coaxed gently. Another rocked so hard it bruised its own arms. The smallest lay still, eyes open, staring into nothing. And Maggie sat outside the nursery door, whining softly. The next morning, a decision was made, not unanimously, not confidently, but out of necessity. Maggie was allowed back, and this time, supervised this time carefully. She walked in slowly, as if she understood the gravity of the invitation. The reaction was immediate. The babies moved toward her without hesitation. One reached out through the bars again, fingers curling in the air. Maggie stepped closer, close enough that her warmth could be felt, close enough for her scent to reach them. She lay down beside the enclosure, pressing her side against it. One baby leaned forward until its forehead rested against the metal. Another followed. The room felt quiet in a way that felt different from before. Not empty, not heavy, just still. People watched in disbelief. This wasn't imprinting in the traditional sense. Maggie didn't replace their mother. She didn't feed them, groom them, or teach them gorilla behavior. What she offered was simpler and somehow more powerful. Presence. When the babies slept, they slept longer. When they woke, they cried less. Feeding improved. Weight stabilized. Their eyes followed Maggie wherever she moved, tracking her. Not with desperation, but with something softer. Trust. Still doubt lingered. What happens when she leaves? Are we creating another loss? Is this helping them or us? These questions hung in the air during meetings and whispered conversations. No one wanted to do harm by accident. The pain of the first loss was still too close, so boundaries were set. Maggie was allowed in only at certain times. Always supervised, always ready to be removed if stress signs appeared. The staff watched for dependency, for anxiety, for any sign this connection was doing more harm than good. Instead, something unexpected happened. The babies began to rely less on constant human presence. They soothed themselves more quickly. They explored their environment in short, tentative bursts. When startled, they no longer panicked immediately. They looked for Maggie first, and Maggie always responded the same way. She lay down. She stayed. She waited. She never forced contact, never demanded attention, never left abruptly. In her quiet consistency, she created something the babies hadn't felt since the night they were orphaned. Safety without expectation. Still, no one called her a mother. Not yet. It felt too dangerous a word, too loaded, too final. But one afternoon, as a caretaker watched the smallest baby fall asleep pressed against the bars where Maggie rested, she whispered almost without realizing it, "She's mothering them." The word lingered, not biologically, not instinctively, but emotionally. Maggie hadn't been trained for this. She hadn't been chosen. She had simply shown up steady, calm, and willing to stay in a room full of broken beginnings. And for the first time since the forest fell silent, hope entered the space not as a plan, but as a possibility. Careful, fragile, and very much alive. Belonging did not arrive all at once. It came quietly disguised as routine. Days at the sanctuary began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Feedings happened on schedule. Medical checks became less urgent. The sharp edge of crisis softened into something more manageable. On paper, progress looked modest, but inside the nursery, something far more important was unfolding. The babies were learning where they fit. At first, their world had been reduced to survival. Eat when food appeared, sleep when exhaustion won, cry when the absence became unbearable. But now, with Maggie's steady presence woven into their days, the babies began to do something they hadn't done since before the forest went silent. They began to explore. It started with small movements. One baby would loosen its grip on the others and crawl a few inches away, stopping often to glance back. Checking, always checking. Another would reach for a new object, then retreat, then try again. These weren't bold steps. They were careful negotiations with a world that had proven itself unreliable. Maggie never followed them. She stayed where she was, body relaxed, eyes half closed, breathing slow and even. She didn't hover. She didn't chase. She made no attempt to direct them back. And somehow that restraint became the anchor they needed. When fear crept in, the babies returned to her on their own. One afternoon during a supervised play session, a sudden noise echoed from outside the building, a truck backfiring, loud and unexpected. The babies froze. For a split second, old panic threatened to resurface, muscles tensing, breath hitching. Then they looked to Maggie. She didn't move. No flinch, no alarm, just calm. The babies exhaled. That moment didn't make the incident report. It didn't change any charts or protocols, but everyone in the room felt it. The babies weren't just surviving anymore. They were regulating, learning how to calm themselves by observing another being who remained calm. This was not something anyone had taught them. It was something they absorbed. Belonging, it turned out, wasn't about replacing what they had lost. It was about building something new around the absence, something stable enough to stand on its own. The babies' interactions with each other changed too. Before, they clung, constantly tangled together in a knot of shared fear. Separation felt dangerous even for seconds. Now they began to play independently, short bursts at first, then longer stretches. One would tug gently at another's arm, testing boundaries. Another would vocalize softly, a sound closer to curiosity than distress. And when disagreements happened, and they did, resolution came faster. The babies no longer escalated into panic. They learned to disengage, to pause, to return to proximity without collapsing into fear. Maggie was never in the middle of these moments. She was simply nearby. The staff noticed changes they hadn't dared hope for so soon. Weight gain improved steadily. Sleep cycles lengthened. Stress behaviors decreased, but beyond the metrics, there was something harder to measure, a lightness that hadn't existed before. The babies made eye contact more often. Their movements became more fluid. Their bodies, once tense and guarded, began to loosen. One caretaker described it quietly during a team meeting. They're not just coping, they're settling. That word stayed with them. Settling didn't mean forgetting. The trauma was still there, layered deep beneath the surface. But the babies were no longer trapped inside it. They were learning how to exist alongside it without being consumed. Maggie's role remained unchanged. She came in at the same times each day. She lay in the same spot. She left the same way she arrived, calmly, without ceremony. There were no dramatic gestures, no moments of obvious affections that cameras could easily capture. And yet the babies waited for her. When she entered, their attention shifted subtly, almost unconsciously. When she left, they noticed, but they no longer panicked. They watched her go, then returned to what they were doing. This too mattered. It meant they were learning that connection did not have to mean dependency, that safety could exist even when the source of comfort stepped away. One evening, as Maggie prepared to leave the nursery, the smallest baby followed her to the edge of the enclosure. It didn't cry. It didn't reach desperately. It simply sat there, watching, head tilted slightly to one side. Maggie paused at the door. She turned, met the baby's gaze, and lay down just for a moment. Long enough to be seen, long enough to say goodbye. Then she stood and left. The baby remained where it was, eyes tracking her, until the door closed. Then it turned back toward the room, toward the other babies, toward the space that was slowly becoming its own. No distress followed. For the staff, watching that moment was harder to process than any crisis had been. It meant the babies were growing. Belonging, they realized, wasn't about constant closeness. It was about trust that connection would return, that presence was reliable, that absence didn't always mean abandonment. The babies had learned something profoundly important without a single word being spoken. They belonged not because someone claimed them, but because someone stayed long enough for them to believe the world could hold them again. At night, when the lights dimmed and the building quieted, the babies slept more soundly. They no longer woke screaming into the dark. When they stirred, they adjusted, settled, and drifted back into rest. Outside, the forest remained unchanged, still missing what it had lost, still marked by absence. Inside, something else was growing, a fragile sense of home, and with it the slow, careful understanding that belonging is not something you are given all at once. It is something you learn one safe moment at a time. The first pushback didn't come with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. It arrived quietly, wrapped in professionalism. It began as emails. Carefully worded messages circulated among administrators, veterinarians, and outside advisors. People who had not sat on the nursery floor at night, who had not heard the babies cry themselves hoarse, who had not watched their bodies slowly learn how to rest again. These messages didn't question the progress. They questioned the process. Attachment risk, long-term developmental impact, emotional dependency concerns. Each phrase landed like a small stone dropped into still water. Maggie's name appeared more often than anyone expected. Not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a variable, something unplanned that made outcomes harder to predict. The sanctuary existed in a world governed by rules, conservation guidelines, ethical frameworks, protocols designed to protect animals from harm, including well-meaning human interference. And while Maggie wasn't human, she wasn't a gorilla either. She existed outside every category the paperwork recognized. That made people uneasy. Meetings followed. In sterile rooms far from the nursery, charts were projected onto screens. Weight gain graphs, cortisol level comparisons, behavioral logs. On paper, the babies were improving. No one disputed that. But the question hovering over the table wasn't whether they were better, it was why. If we allow this bond to continue, one advisor said carefully, we need to be prepared for the consequences when it ends. When it ends. The phrase echoed long after the meeting adjourned. Back in the nursery, the babies had no idea a debate was happening around them. They were busy with the work of growing, testing balance, discovering textures, learning the limits of their own strength. Maggie continued to arrive and leave, as she always had, unaware that her presence was now under review. The staff felt the shift before anything changed. Hands lingered on clipboards. Conversations dropped into whispers. People watched Maggie more closely, not with suspicion, but with the weight of responsibility pressing down on their shoulders. Everyone understood the stakes. If this connection went too far, it could complicate the baby's future integration with other gorillas. It could blur boundaries that conservation work relied on. And if the bond was severed abruptly later, the damage could be worse than if it ended now. Logic made its case with ruthless clarity, but logic had not been the one sitting beside a trembling infant at 3 in the morning. The first adjustment was subtle. Maggie's visits were shortened by a few minutes, then by a little more. Always framed as temporary, always explained as necessary for assessment. The staff watched closely for signs of regression, changes in appetite, sleep disruption, renewed distress. The babies noticed immediately. They didn't panic, not at first. They simply waited. When Maggie didn't arrive at her usual time, one baby paced the length of the enclosure, stopping often to look toward the door. Another vocalized softly, not a cry, but a questioning sound as if asking whether something had changed. When Maggie did arrive later than usual, the relief was visible, not explosive, not desperate, but unmistakable. Bodies relaxed, attention softened. The room breathed again. That response was documented, not as proof of success, but as evidence of attachment. The tension escalated. Some argued the bond had already served its purpose and should now be phased out gently. Others insisted that removing Maggie too soon could destabilize the progress the babies had made. There was no villain in the room, only people trying to choose the lesser of two unknown harms. In the midst of it all, Maggie remained unchanged. She didn't cling. She didn't seek out the babies beyond her designated times. She didn't whine when redirected. She accepted every new boundary without protest, as if instinctively understanding that her role was not to fight for space, but to offer it. The babies, however, began to change in ways that made decisions harder. They started forming stronger bonds with their human caretakers, something that had not happened before. They approached hands willingly. They allowed examinations with less resistance. They showed curiosity toward enrichment activities designed to simulate natural behaviors. This wasn't dependence, it was confidence. One senior caretaker pointed this out quietly during a review session. "They're not clinging to her because they can't cope," she said. "They're coping because they learned how." That observation shifted the conversation, but not the outcome. A trial separation was approved. 1 full day without Maggie. The decision was explained gently to the staff, though no explanation made it easier. That morning, Maggie was kept outside the nursery. She lay near the door, calm as ever, unaware that her absence was being tested. Inside, the babies sensed something immediately. They searched. They waited. They listened. The first hours passed without incident. The babies played as they rested. Staff exhaled cautiously. Maybe the transition would be easier than feared. Then came the afternoon. Fatigue set in. One baby tripped during play and startled itself. Instead of crying briefly and recovering, it froze. Another baby rushed over, pressing close. The smallest sat apart, watching the door. A soft whimper emerged, then another. The room grew tense. Caretakers responded quickly, offering comfort, redirecting attention, increasing engagement. The baby settled, but the effort it took was noticeably greater than before. The equilibrium Maggie had helped create was missing, and everyone could feel the strain of holding it together without her. That night, sleep came in fragments again. Nothing catastrophic happened. No dramatic breakdown, no irreversible damage. But something was undeniably harder. The next morning, Maggie was allowed back in. Her return didn't cause a surge of excitement. There were no frantic movements, no desperate cries. The baby simply noticed and relaxed. That was the moment that changed the tone of the debate. Not because it proved Maggie was indispensable, but because it showed she was doing something no one else had been able to replicate. Not perfectly, not yet. She was not replacing the world. She was buffering it. The world, however, did not yield easily. Policies still had to be followed. Long-term plans still had to be made. And no matter how effective Maggie was, she could not stay forever. Everyone knew that. The question was no longer whether the world would push back. It was how gently. As discussions continued, a new understanding began to take shape, not in documents or protocols, but in quiet agreement among those closest to the babies. This bond did not need to last forever. It needed to last long enough. Long enough for the babies to internalize safety, long enough to carry that lesson forward, long enough to face the next transition without breaking. The world might push back, but it could not erase what had already been learned. And in that fragile space between regulation and compassion, the sanctuary stood at a crossroads, trying imperfectly to choose love without causing harm. Because sometimes the hardest part of care isn't knowing when to step in, it's knowing how and when to step away. Love did not leave the way everyone expected it to. There was no final moment marked by doors closing or a last lingering look across the room. No dramatic separation, no single day when everything suddenly changed. Instead, love faded into the background, the way it often does when it has done its work well, quietly, almost invisibly, leaving behind strength rather than dependence. By the time the long-term plan was put into motion, the babies were no longer the fragile creatures who had arrived wrapped in shock and silence. Their bodies were stronger now, their movements surer. Their eyes, once wide with fear, carried curiosity instead. They played more than they cried. They rested more than they watched the door. Maggie was still part of their days, but no longer the center of them. Her visits became shorter, then less frequent, not because the bond had weakened, but because the babies no longer needed her in the same way. When she arrived, they acknowledged her with soft sounds and brief attention, then returned to their exploration. When she left, they noticed, but they did not unravel. That was the change no chart could capture. They had learned how to hold safety inside themselves. The transition happened slowly enough that no single moment felt like loss. Maggie would come in, lie down for a while, and leave again. Sometimes she wouldn't come at all. On those days, the babies adjusted. They sought comfort from one another. They leaned into familiar routines. They rested in spaces that had become their own. The staff watched carefully, hearts tight with the fear of missing something. But what they saw instead was resilience. The smallest baby, the one who had once cried until its voice cracked, began initiating play. It tugged gently at its companions, testing strength and boundaries. When startled, it paused, assessed, and recovered without panic. That self-soothing motion, born of trauma, had softened into something else entirely. Adaptation. Maggie's role shifted almost naturally. She became less a presence in the nursery and more a quiet figure on the periphery of the sanctuary again. She resumed her wandering, her silent patrols during storms, her habit of sitting beside stressed animals in other enclosures. She did not return to the nursery every day, and that was okay. One afternoon, during what would be her final extended visit, Maggie lay down in her familiar spot beside the enclosure. The babies approached briefly, touching noses to the bars, then drifted away to resume their play. Maggie watched them, head resting on her paws, eyes soft. She did not call them back. She did not move closer. She simply stayed long enough to be seen. When she stood to leave, no one stopped her. The babies looked up as the door opened, tracked her movement for a moment, then returned to what they were doing. There were no cries, no reaching hands, no panic. For the staff observing from the doorway, that quiet acceptance hit harder than any breakdown could have. It meant the bond had completed its arc. It had given what it needed to give, and nothing more. In the weeks that followed, the babies were gradually introduced to new environments, new structures, and eventually other gorillas under carefully controlled conditions. Each step forward carried risk, but the foundation held. They approached unfamiliar situations with caution, not fear. They observed before reacting. They leaned into social cues. They showed flexibility, one of the most important traits for survival in any social species. When stress appeared, it did not spiral. The imprint Maggie left behind wasn't visible in any single behavior. It lived in patterns, in how quickly calm returned, in how trust was extended, in how absence was tolerated without collapsing into despair. Love had not made them weaker. It had made them capable. Maggie was never reintroduced during these later stages. There was no need. Her job had already been done. The sanctuary staff spoke of her less often now, not because she was forgotten, but because her influence had become woven into the baby's normalcy. She had become part of their past, not their present, and that was exactly as it should be. One caretaker, watching the young gorillas interact confidently with their new surroundings, said quietly, "She didn't teach them how to be gorillas. She taught them how to feel safe enough to learn." That understanding reframed everything. Love in this case had not been about permanence. It had been about timing. Maggie hadn't filled the space left by the mothers the babies lost. She had held that space open just long enough for something else to grow inside it. Confidence, regulation, belonging. The forest outside the sanctuary was still missing what it had lost. That absence could never be undone. But within the walls of the rescue center, something different had taken root. A reminder that healing doesn't erase grief, but it can soften its edges. The babies would not remember Maggie the way humans remember a face or a name. Their memory would live in sensation in how the world felt when it stopped being unbearable. They would carry that forward. And Maggie, back to her quiet routines, carried nothing but what she had always carried: an instinct to stay when others needed her, and the wisdom to leave when they no longer did. Love did not stay. It didn't need to. It left behind something far more enduring: the ability to go on. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with understanding. What happened to those orphaned gorilla babies was never about a miracle in the way people usually imagine miracles. There was no single moment when everything suddenly became perfect. No dramatic reversal of fate. No erasing of loss. Their mothers were still gone. The forest that once held them was still silent in all the ways that mattered. And yet something undeniable changed. This story reminds us that healing is not about replacing what was lost. It is about learning how to live with the absence without letting it define the future. The gorilla babies did not forget their mothers. They didn't move on as if nothing had happened. What they learned instead was how to exist in a world that had already shown them pain and still find safety within it. The most powerful lesson came from the most unexpected place. Maggie was never meant to be a solution. She wasn't trained, assigned, or even planned. She didn't follow a manual. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply stayed calm, consistent, and present at a time when presence itself was rare. And in doing so, she demonstrated something we often overlook: that comfort doesn't require perfection, expertise, or permanence. It requires reliability. In a world obsessed with control, this story gently pushes back. It shows us that healing doesn't always come from carefully designed systems or rigid protocols. Sometimes it comes from noticing what is needed in the moment and having the courage to allow it, even when it doesn't fit neatly into expectations. The sanctuary staff didn't abandon science. They didn't ignore ethics. What they did was listen deeply and humbly to what the animals were showing them. They allowed evidence to be more than numbers on a chart. They allowed behavior, emotion, and resilience to matter. And because of that, the gorilla babies didn't grow up dependent. They grew up capable. That distinction is everything. Love did not weaken them. Love did not delay their development. Love prepared them. The story also challenges the way we define family. It reminds us that family is not always about biology or permanence. Sometimes it is about timing, about showing up when it matters most and stepping away when the other is ready to stand on their own. Maggie did not stay forever, and that was the point. True care is not about holding on. It is about giving enough support for someone else to move forward without you. For us as humans, that lesson extends far beyond wildlife stories. It speaks to parenting, to caregiving, to leadership, and to compassion itself. It asks us to consider whether our role in someone else's life is to be essential forever or to be essential just long enough. In a time when the world often feels overwhelming, divided and indifferent, stories like this matter. They remind us that gentleness can coexist with strength, that empathy is not weakness, and that even across species, the need for safety, consistency, and care is universal. These are the animal stories that stay with us, not because they are dramatic, but because they are true in a deeper sense. They reflect parts of ourselves we recognize immediately, even when the characters don't speak our language. If this story moved you, challenged you, or simply gave you a moment of quiet reflection, you're not alone. And there are many more animal stories like this, stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the quiet power of compassion. If you want to support more stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps keep these animal stories alive, reaching more people who need them, and gives us the motivation to keep sharing moments that matter. Because sometimes the smallest acts of care leave the biggest legacy, and sometimes love doesn't stay, but what it leaves behind changes everything.